Ho ho ho! That one merry day is here again. Or probably tomorrow, depending on when this is uploaded. I'm not entirely sure just yet. So while this year may not have been as ideal as was advertised, the good news is that there's only a few days left to sail through. Then we can all look back on this as another funny memory. At least, one can only hope at this point. For who knows what trying obstacles will come for us next year, as most events could never be foreseen until they take effect, and end up potentially changing a lot more than expected in the future. Oh right, Christmas. Last year I was going into Christmas movies that can help deliver the festive spirit. Unless you're not into the works of Rankin and Bass, in which case, those might not be for you. So how about we go into another type of Christmas classic, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. What started off as an average book published in 1843 blew up over the following centuries into many different TV specials and movies. It's a tale that still stands powerful even to this day. A cranky old timer lost his Christmas spirit and ends up haunted by various ghosts, as they do everything in their power to get him to clean up his act. Otherwise, he'll face severe consequences. 'Tis a story beloved by many individuals and money-hungry corporations alike. While gathering material for this countdown, I found there were noticeably more Christmas Carol-based movies than I realized. And originally I was going to make this video top 10, but I got blasted by unexpected obstacles, like my computer constantly acting up, been having to take on extra last-minute shifts at work, which led to a major time crunch. So because of that, and to stick to my traditional superstitious route, I ended up narrowing it down to 7 movies. The only rules I made here is that these have to center around the story of A Christmas Carol, naturally, and these have to be at least a half hour long, not including the additional time for commercial breaks. That to me is the difference between a movie and an average TV episode. And now with all that said, time to start up. Let's hop on the sleigh and start diving into the Christmas cheer. But first, time for a lightning round. I'm gonna quickly tackle the 3 movies that almost made it onto the list, but got turned into honorable mentions. Ready, set, go. First was the Flintstones Christmas Carol, a very beloved Hanna-Barbera franchise getting a Christmas movie. They're getting ready for their own rendition of A Christmas Carol, and these characters fit the role surprisingly well. But this felt too similar to another movie which ended up on the list, so naturally I'll be covering that one later. Next we have A Christmas Carol of 1971. This was a more straightforward telling of the story. There was beautiful attention to detail, both with the writing and animation, but it was under the time requirements, so I couldn't include that one. And Mickey's Christmas Carol had a similar problem. I would have counted this had it been a few minutes longer. And it kinda hurts because I love this one so much. The animation was smooth, they brought back a few classic characters, and Alan Young's here again. And by now you probably know how much I loved him. Maybe I'll find a way to talk about it next year. Alright, now to finally start up the list itself. A Christmas Carol, 1999. How could you go wrong with someone like Patrick Stewart? Besides that, he's one of the most charming and recognizable actors in history. He's mostly known for his work in Star Trek and X-Men. Being as familiar with him as I am, I already knew right off the bat that he'd be the most appropriate choice for Scrooge in one of these movies. And this was where he finally got his chance. He also got a second inning back in 2006, even though that was just an audiobook. But still, Sir Patrick Stewart's performance was about as strong as you'd expect.
Oh, let me wash away the writing on this stone!
There's nothing too big in the story to bring up, as they were trying to go more traditional and straightforward in this movie. Although there were some moments I deeply admired in this version, like the window scene with all the ghosts. It looked rather creepy, but still impressive. Though my favorite was the scene with Christmas Present giving Scrooge his own tour while everyone was singing Silent Night. That was beautiful. And would you believe this movie was brought to us by Hallmark? Well, actually it was Hallmark back then. But they ended up giving the original movie rights to Sonar and entertainment rights, which kinda sucks, especially when you see what kind of Hallmark movies we got nowadays. Sure, there might be a few scenes where the special effects might feel a little off, but that didn't stop it from being a movie worth watching. Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol. Ah, Mr. Magoo, one of the most charming and beloved cartoon characters in history. His style of humor was clever, but still very innocent. And Jim Backus gave him a wonderful voice. In this movie, Magoo's part of a theater production of A Christmas Carol, where he plays Scrooge. This kinda ties into his spin-off, Mr. Magoo's Literary Classics, where he reenacts various stories through theater, playing different characters, kinda similar to this movie. As for this movie, the animation's pretty much the same as it was in the shows, but these characters and designs are more unique and memorable. They also threw in a bunch of original songs to go with the story, and the writers aced the moods they wanted to deliver with these songs. They range from goofy to depressing to hopeful. They were above all catchy and very memorable. The only criticism I really have with this movie is that, while this version of the story is charming and shows a lot of dedication to the original source, they could have thrown a few more Magoo jokes in. Sure, they still managed to deliver some, and I'm glad they took the story seriously when they needed to at the same time, but I feel there were a few scenes where they could have slipped in one of his Magoo gags, without it feeling too jarring, but they skipped on the opportunities, like in the more uneventful scenes where he's flying or running or walking. As I said, it's not like this would have been impossible. There are a few brief examples in the movie, and The Simpsons even gave a decent example in their parody. But still, this is a very enjoyable movie. It was beloved during its time, and it seems many people have still fondly remembered it in recent years, since there were a few theater companies arranging their own live performances on it. Scrooge. I can't imagine a whole lot of modern movie fans are familiar with Scrooge's actor, Albert Finney, outside of this movie, unless you remember his character from Corpse Bride. But here's a star in the movie I know everyone will recognize, Alec Guinness, who plays Marley himself.
Why do you walk the earth? Why do you come to persecute me?
You will go to the Dagobah system. There you will learn from Yoda.
This is a pairing I never expected to see, but they're still fun to watch together. The story was much better than I thought it was going to be. For starters, this is a full-out musical, and as you know, that's one of the most surefire ways to win me over. And most of the songs were very enjoyable too. Although I'll admit, Scrooge's song about Belle was a little forgettable, which, given the story's context, is not a good sign. But the entire remainder of the soundtrack definitely makes up for it. This version of the story took a few extra steps which came out pretty surprising, like how Scrooge was celebrating his own death without realizing it. That was kinda clever. Or how about that scene where he literally goes to hell? My god! These writers certainly didn't pull any punches! But in the end, as obscure as it may be, it can still be a surprisingly wonderful creative rendition of the story, with a powerful depiction and original catchy songs. A Christmas Carol, 2009. Disney has done it again. With the help of Robert Zemeckis and Image Movers, they created one of the most visually impressive renditions of A Christmas Carol, which in a way is kind of saying something, since Image Movers had a few holes in their legacy, specifically due to the motion capture films. Need I remind you all of Mars Needs Moms? But in this movie, the animation style actually helped enhance the story. For starters, unlike Mars Needs Moms, there are no aliens required, so that's a relief, and the animation's rather fitting with this kind of atmosphere. A Christmas Carol was always a dark story in general, and the animators were not afraid to show it. As for the cast, the Scrooge in this movie was voiced by, believe it or not, Jim Carrey, who also took on the roles of the three spirits. Like I said a while back, I find Jim Carrey to be a hit or miss kind of guy. Some of his movies are pretty enjoyable, while others range from to just painful. But I can safely say this was one of his better movies. Despite his typical movie personality, Carrey portrayed these characters surprisingly well. He took himself very seriously, but still felt like his usual goofy self at times. And it never felt out of place. Besides Carrey, there were a few other stars playing the side characters, such as Gary Oldman, Carrie Yoas, even Bob Hoskins. The writers and animators went all out with Scrooge's dream sequences. There were so many wild moments going on. They went from downright terrifying to creative and upbeat, and at sometimes very suspenseful. I'm very surprised Disney went this far to give us such an accurate and well-detailed rendition of the story. If you haven't seen this movie yet, and you think you can live through the nightmare fuel, then this is one you might want to watch. Scrooged. This is definitely the most unique version of the story I've ever seen, in terms of atmosphere anyway. Instead of the typical ye olde London setting, this story takes place in 1980s Brooklyn, and the Scrooge character, named Frank Cross, was played by Bill Murray of all people. Around this time, some of his other movie characters had a very similar Scroogey, or at least snarky feel, like Phil from Groundhog Day, and in some sense, Venkman from Ghostbusters. Only this time, his character, Frank Cross, is a direct Scrooge. But the writers still found ways to make this different. Instead of a generic businessman, Cross is the head of a TV studio. He and his team are working on their own rendition of A Christmas Carol. Ironic much? But unlike the casual Scrooge who's obsessed with money, Cross is pushing his team around and throwing fits when something doesn't go his way during production. Maybe I'm alone, but Bill Murray's one of the very few people who can make even a common tantrum look amusing. Another big difference the story adds is that we have not one but two Cratchits thrown in. The first one being Elliot Loudermilk, who starts going insane after Cross fired him, to the point where he even tries to kill him. and the second one being Grace Cooley, who follows the more traditional route, just a more lower-class citizen who's trying to support her son Calvin, who's the story's Tiny Tim. Unfortunately, the rest of the family doesn't seem to be as caring, which can also be a little concerning. In addition, there are a few big celebrities thrown in for both background and major characters, like David Johnson and Carol Kane, who played the spirits. I especially like Kane's performance for Christmas Present Spirit. She's got the appearance of Glinda, but with a far more aggressive side. Speaking of which, while this movie had a noticeable amount of slapstick, it never manages to get old. Hell, even to this day, I still laugh at the
Would you hold the goddamn hammering, please?
gag. The layout of the story as a whole follows a pattern. Cross goes about his day, then starts hallucinating, runs into a spirit, ends up back in reality, rinse, repeat. It may come off a little predictable, but the transitions that back it up are very creative. So if you're looking for a Christmas Carol movie that can break the mold, this might be a first you want to check out. Blackadder's Christmas Carol. Rowan Atkinson is someone who I believe needs no introduction, but just in case some of you still aren't familiar with him, he's best known for his TV personality, Mr. Bean. Even though he was in many other shows and movies, it seems that just about everyone connects him to Bean first. But even before Mr. Bean was created, there was another sitcom he was known for, which was Blackadder. The show's setup was kinda similar to Pinky and the Brain, but without any world domination. The show usually consists of Blackadder and his bumbling sidekick Baldric running into an obstacle and trying to get around it with a cunning plan, as Baldric would say.
Don't worry, Mr. B. I have a cunning plan to solve the problem.
Yes, Baldric, let us not forget that you tried to solve the problem of your mother's low ceiling by cutting off her head.
There were other big stars in the show working alongside Atkinson too, like Stephen Fry, Miranda Richardson, and Hugh Laurie, just to name a few. On to his Christmas Carol. What made this movie so unique was that, much unlike the Blackadders of the past, or at least season 2 and onward, this Blackadder is nowhere near as smug or insolent as his ancestors. And that's even more ironic knowing that he represents Scrooge in this movie. This is basically a complete 180 of the traditional story, but that still feels very fitting with the franchise. As expected, Blackadder gets visited by a spirit and shows him his past. Well, actually it's his ancestors' pasts. But it's not until Blackadder sees the future when he decides to change his life for the worse, as he feels it will help improve his life, as well as the future of his family line. Although this ends up coming back to bite him in the ass. So the writers basically flipped the story on its head, and as a result, we got an unexpectedly clever and hilarious movie. This one's worth a watch if you're a fan of the BBC comedy style, or specifically Rowan Atkinson. And now... The Muppets Christmas Carol. There is so much to love about this movie. The story's told well while throwing in some jokes that aren't too out of place. Hell, some of the jokes are even kinda clever too. Speaking of which, the Muppet characters perfectly fit these roles, though some might feel like a bit of a stretch, like having Gonzo as Dickens, the narrator, but he was so charming I had to let it slide. You can say his screen time with Rizzo felt more like filler, but could you really say you never cracked a smile at least once at one of their bits? And how about Scrooge? I'm sure we all know Michael Caine, especially if you remember The Dark Knight or even any of his other movies. Out of all the Scrooges I've seen in these movies, he's my all-time favorite. His performance felt the most natural and endearing at the same time. One of the biggest examples being his duet in Belle's song. And speaking of which, who could forget the soundtrack this movie had? These songs really helped the flow of the story. There was so much care into them, and it showed through the delivery. They were catchy, memorable, and sometimes very sweet and emotional. It's a real shame that Jim Henson never got to see this one. I'm sure he would have been proud to see what Brian's made from his work. If nothing else, this is the movie that I need to make time for every year, for this is my favorite Christmas Carol movie. The reason why the story is still cherished to this day, besides the iconic atmosphere, is that it's got one of the best morals to deliver. Plain and simple, don't be such an evil schmuck during the holiday season. It's better to give what you can and help share the Christmas spirit. So whatever the day may bring to you, we, the Nunny and Business team members, wish you and your loved ones happy holidays.